to say good afternoon to everybody and thank everybody for being here today for the launch of Dr. Michael Byrne's research report, Security and Agency in the Irish Private Rented Sector. And I'd like to just remind everybody that there's a hashtag for today's event, which is hashtag empowering renters. So that's hashtag capital E and capital R. I'd also just, like to remind everybody that the private rented sector in Ireland is very much a changed space to what it was even a decade ago, that we're looking at historically low levels of home ownership and historically higher levels of renting. We're also, dealing with what Adriana has written about and Mick has written about, generation rent. It's become a byword for a society where people are in effect trapped in the rented sector in a way that they don't wish to be. And certainly from research that we've conducted within Threshold, we know that a lot of our clients feel hopelessly insecure in the rented sector and really want to be secure and see the rented sector as not a place where they can find that type of security. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the people who will be presenting today. I'm starting with Dr. Michael Byrne. Oh, and by the way, just we're all getting used to Zoom conferencing and all the rest of it. Could I just remind you that we have a question and answer session at the end, and that there's a button on the bottom of your screen for questions. So if you would keep that in mind and keep the questions coming in, and we will have, as I said, about 15 minutes at the end to address the questions. So without further ado, I'd like to thank our panelists for being here today. Dr. Michael Byrne, he's a lecturer in the School of Social Policy, Social Work and Social Justice in UCD. He's also the Director of Equality Studies for the Masters in Social Science. His work focuses on the political economy of housing, and in particular focuses on the private rental sector. His recent publications include Towards a Political Economy of the Private Rented Sector, published in Critical Housing Analysis, and Generation Rent and the Financialization of Housing and Housing Studies. Today, Dr. Michael Byrne will speak about his latest research, which was researched and written before COVID-19, but I think we will all agree when we hear his presentations that the findings of his report will tell us a lot about the challenging future that we face in managing the fallout from COVID-19, particularly in the private rented sector. We also have with us today Dr. Adriana Michaela Suita, a research fellow at the University of Glasgow and a member of the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence. Her experience as a Romanian chartered architect and planner aroused her fascination with the multiplicity of meanings attached to housing. Her research has since focused on the individual's experience of housing and how they have shaped and shape the socioeconomic and spatial, excuse me, I've lost a page here of my notes, which is a bit unfortunate. Sorry about that. This is one of the issues of Zoom, my apologies, inequalities. Adriana has published on the British housing private tenants' experiences of home and their future aspirations, as well as on why and how home is increasingly positioned as a base for welfare by British homeowners and landlords alike. Her academic interests also expand beyond housing and cover issues of social capital, trust and tenant activism. From our point of view, certainly the whole idea of ontological security and the whole issue of home has become something that Threshold has become very interested in over the last number of years. Because while we've seen a lot of improvements in terms of regulation of the private rented sector, we also see how it is not seen as a home within the context of Irish housing. After that, we will have a presentation from Threshold's own Anne-Marie O'Reilly. She's our policy officer. And prior to joining Threshold in 2019, she worked with Focus Ireland as part of their team of management, looking particularly at supported housing services. So she's a lot of experience of people within the housing and homelessness sector. On top of that, she has 2 master's degrees, not one. One was not good enough. So, and she has a wide experience, particularly coming from within Threshold. Because of her position in policy, she crosses over a large number of departments. While I'm speaking, I'd also like to thank the Threshold staff who participated in this research. I know and Mick in the foreword to the report acknowledged, the importance of the contribution that the frontline experiences of Threshold staff made to the report, and obviously also to the participants who engaged within the report. But I'd also very much like to thank the funders of the report. It's always difficult, I know, to get funding for housing research in a country where housing is supposedly top of the agenda. Ironically, getting money to study it is a very, very difficult thing to achieve. So on everyone's behalf, on Threshold's behalf, and I'm sure on behalf of Mick as well, I'd like to thank the Irish Research Council for their funding of this project. So without further ado, just to remind you, our hashtag empowering renters, and please put in your questions by clicking at the base of the your screen. So Dr. Michael Byrne, if you'd like to kick off, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thanks, Aileen. Let me just share my slideshow. Okay, you can see that, Aileen, yeah? Okay, brilliant. So listen, thanks a million to everybody for joining us today. On behalf of myself and my co-author, Dr. Rachel McCardle, I'm absolutely delighted to be launching the report. We were both thrilled to have the opportunity to collaborate with Threshold on this project because, anybody who has an interest in housing in Ireland, and certainly in the private rental sector, knows the hugely important role that Threshold play in the sector, and especially in supporting tenants. So it was a great experience, and I learned a lot. I would particularly like to thank Kathy Flanagan for organising today's launch, and the Threshold advisors who helped, in particular, recruiting our interviewees for the project. And a special thanks to Anne-Marie O'Reilly, who you'll hear from later, who provided huge support and input and insight throughout the whole process of putting this piece of research together. The report is big enough, and we don't have a huge amount of time today. So what I'm going to do in today's presentation is just to focus briefly on the kind of background to the report and the research design, and then to spend most of the time talking about our key findings and presenting some of our data and our analysis. So I'll jump right into the background. And we know there's been a huge amount of legislative change in the private rental sector over recent years on a number of different levels. But unfortunately, the core issues in the sector, such as problems around insecurity, the rental sector's contribution to the homelessness crisis, and the affordability issues, those core issues remain as significant problems in spite of all that policy. And what that kind of draws our attention to is our regulatory and enforcement regime in the private rental sector. And that is one that we would describe as tenant-led in significant respects, right? Because it's up to the tenant in most instances to identify breaches of their rights and breaches of the legislation, and then to take action to address those breaches, either by challenging their landlord, perhaps with support from Threshold or another organisation, or by registering a dispute with the RTB. So our tenant-led regulatory regime is predicated on the assumption that tenants are in a position to advocate for themselves, right? That tenants have agency within their tenancies. But there have long been concerns that the limited nature of security of tenure undermines that agency, right? So what we wanted to do with this report is to generate evidence around this issue, around tenants' experience of insecurity and the impact that has on their agency, on their ability to advocate for themselves, and then how all of this can contribute to issues around enforcement and issues around non-compliance in the private rental sector. I think the RPZ legislation is a good example of all this, where we have seen that since the introduction of the 4% rent caps, average annual rent increases have remained stubbornly above 4% in Dublin since then. And we know from the ESRI research last year that within the RPZs, as many or more than 40% of tenants experienced rent increases above 4%. And that points to the significance of this issue around compliance, I would argue, and then from there, that important role of tenants, tenant agency, and security. So to address this, we need, of course, to, I think in particular, conceptualize security, and most importantly, move beyond a narrow focus on what we might call a de jure understanding of security of tenure, right? An analysis that focuses solely or on the security of tenure as it's set out in legislation. We adopt Hudson Milligan's concept of secure occupancy, which broadens out beyond that more narrow conception, and in particular, it puts the tenant's experience center stage. I think that is something that really emerges from our research as well. The issue of security and insecurity needs to be seen first and foremost from the perspective of tenants' experience in the rental sector. And there's a couple of important aspects to this. I mean, first of all, the difference between what's there in the legislation and what tenants' experience might be in practice, right? So you could have potentially quite strong security of tenure, but if market conditions are such that tenants are experiencing, frequent high rent increases that lead to loss of tenancy, well, that security of tenure on paper is not going to be so meaningful. And similarly, if you have a culture of non-compliance in the sector, well, again, what's there in the legislation is not going to be as significant as it might seem on first look. So, I mean, it's not that the legislation isn't important; it absolutely is important, but it's more so that the importance of the legislation, or the legislation is important to the extent that it actually shapes tenants' experience, to the extent that tenants experience it in their rental accommodation. So we broaden out to look not just at legislation, but also at the market context, and in terms of affordability, in terms of supply, and the cultural context in terms of the norms and values around property ownership, around the status of private renting tenants, around meanings of home, and so on. And then finally, we also need to bring in the social and economic capital of tenants, because tenants' experience are different, and they differ in particular in relation to income levels, migration status, family status, and so on. So because of our focus on tenants' experience of security understood in this multidimensional sense, we adopt in-depth qualitative interviews for this research project, and we conducted interviews with 24 tenants, 16 in Dublin and 6 in Galway and 2 in Cork. And we also interviewed threshold advisors who are working, if you like, on the coalface of these issues every day. Our focus was on tenants who are experiencing an issue and who are seeking to address an issue, right? Because we were trying to understand the extent to which tenants can do that, the extent to which they can advocate for themselves. So we recruited our interviewees from current threshold clients through the advisors. And we also ensured that our sample broadly reflected some of the main characteristics of the wider tenant population in terms of gender, in terms of migration status, and so on. There's a few caveats in relation to our sample and the data collection that I'd like to just raise before going any further. The first is that rent subsidy recipients, be it HAP or rent supplement, were overrepresented in our sample. So that means I think that our research is particularly relevant for tenants, more lower income tenants, and especially tenants in receipt of those subsidies. Our sample was also primarily made up of tenants who are tenants of small scale or non-professional landlords, which is of course they represent the majority of landlords. But that does mean that I think our research is perhaps particularly relevant for that group as opposed to the more institutional sector. And as that sector becomes more important in the future, I think we'll need more research on tenants' experiences there. And then finally, the data collection was conducted in summer and autumn of 2019. So it was before the latest RTB enforcement powers were really put into effect. And that's still at quite an early stage. So we've yet to really see what that looks like in practice and what the impact on the sector is going to be. So just worth bearing in mind. I do hope, however, that our findings can inform the implementation of those new powers. And I think there are some relevant findings in that regard. So for the remainder of the presentation, I'll just focus on our key findings. I don't have time to go through it all, but I'll just focus on the key constraints for tenants agency that emerged through our research. And then I'll step back and provide some analysis. And there are 4 key constraints that emerged consistently across our interviews. The first is fear of conflict. Tenants seek to avoid and fear conflict with their landlord. And this is not just because of the consequences of conflict, such as loss of tenancy, which I'll come to in a minute, but also because of the experience of conflict in itself, right? Tenants fear conflict per se. And there are 2 dimensions to that are worth pointing out or highlighting, I think. The first is a lot of this has to do with the nature of the landlord-tenant relationship, which for our interviewees was highly informal and usually interpersonal type of relationship, right? Rather than a more, what we might think of as a more professional relationship. And what that meant was that when the relationship between the landlord and tenant broke down, often it became very much in the nature of interpersonal conflicts, it became very heated, often very emotional and very messy. And navigating that and managing that complex, heated interpersonal relationship generated significant stress and anxiety for our interviewees. In one of the quotes there that you can see on this slide, for example, an interviewee wonders about how nasty it's going to get as the conflict plays out with the landlord. And that was certainly something we've seen with numerous interviewees. A second dimension to this fear of conflict is the fact that for our interviewees, once they are in a significant conflict with their landlord, for example, disputing a rent notice or a significant minimum standards issue, tenants already at that point lose some of the key characteristics of home. Once they're in the conflict, they lose characteristics of home such as feelings of peace, a feeling of safety, a feeling of stability and predictability, feeling of control over one's domestic environment. Right? The conflict in and of itself undermines those issues. And we see in the quote on the screen at the moment, for example, one interviewee, when asked if she felt at home since the outbreak of conflict, she replied, "No, definitely not. We just go there to put our head down. It's not a home." And again, that was something that we came across a lot in the interviewees, and a really quite significant amount of anxiety and stress that tenants experience as a result of this type of conflict. In addition, of course, we have a fear of loss of tenancy, and this emerged as a huge issue. Tenants at the outset of experiencing an issue and attempting to address it, for example, in particular by going to threshold or registering a dispute with the RTB. At that stage already, tenants anticipate that one possible outcome is that they may lose their tenancy. This is factored into decision making at an early stage, and it represents a major constraint on tenants' ability to advocate for themselves. And we heard that time and time again, that they were afraid, a tenant saying, I'm afraid I'll be kicked out if I go to the RTB, or if my landlord knows I've called threshold. And again, there's a couple of aspects to this that we can unpick. I think the first is that tenants really feel that landlords can end tenancies at will. That was the case across the board from our interviewees. And they do so, I think, because in part, the scope for landlords to terminate tenancies under the Residential Tenancies Act is quite large, right? There's quite a number of grounds. And a number of those grounds relate to the intentions that landlords have for the future. So they relate to intention to sell, intention to refurbish the property, intention to use the property personally. And because they relate to intentions, really landlords are the only people who are in a position to verify that. And this creates a perception among tenants that the ball is very much in the landlord's court, and that the tenant can do little to ensure that the tenancy does not come to an end. In addition, there was a pretty consistent view that our interviewees believe landlords are willing to go outside the scope of the legislation to terminate a tenancy, right? So we see that in the quotes on this slide, the idea that a landlord will do whatever it takes. You know, if a landlord is determined to get a tenant out, they will find a way. So there's a real fear on the part of tenants that they will lose their tenancy and that they have few protections in that regard. And that fear does appear to be grounded. The majority of our interviewees, when they addressed an issue, for example, through the RTB or another avenue, they did experience at that point either threats of eviction or some form of harassment, and even some instances of quite serious intimidation. And 1/3 of our sample experienced a retaliatory eviction, right? So although under the Residential Tenancies Act, retaliatory actions or penalization of tenants is prohibited, this our research suggests that this is a part of the experience of some tenants, and it does represent a constraint on tenants and tenants' agency. So we have definitely a really clear relationship between insecurity in a broad sense and agency emerged in the research, and that was really intensified or reinforced by the market context, right? The overall effect of the market context is to intensify tenants' dependence on their current landlord. Because of the imbalance in between demand and supply in the rental market, tenants feel that it is extremely difficult to find an alternative property, and if they do find an alternative property, it will be at a higher price, right? So there's really significant incentives in the structure of the rental market for tenants to remain in their current tenancy, and of course that may mean avoiding conflict with their current landlord, as we've seen. Tenants also feel easily replaced because of those market conditions, so they feel that it's very easy for landlords to replace the tenant, whereas it's very difficult for the tenant to replace their current accommodation with another home. So those market conditions are really tenants experience them as disempowering, and that in turn intensifies the constraint that tenants experience when seeking to advocate for themselves. One further point here that emerged really strongly was that tenants and our interviewees really dread the prospect of being in the rental market looking for a home. Our interviewees spoke really quite movingly at times about the distress, the anxiety, the frustration of sending hundreds of emails to landlords and getting no response, attending dozens of viewings and not getting a property, and a feeling of a lack of control, a frustration, as one tenant put it, a feeling that you're begging to be housed. And that in itself is something that tenants are hugely motivated to avoid. And I think that can certainly lead to tenants being willing to accept or put up with, as many of our interviewees said, breaches of their rights in their current home. And then those issues in the market, that market context is kind of multiplied for tenants who are experiencing discrimination or the negative effects of what we call landlord selectivity, right? So certain cohorts of tenants have experienced discrimination, right? And almost all of our interviewees talked about the idea that what landlords want is a professional couple with no children, that's the kind of ideal, and tenants often describe themselves in how they deviate from that idea. And in particular, tenants with children spoke an awful lot about the difficulty of finding a property when you have children. Lone parents, that this was kind of doubly so for lone parents who spoke about being invisible in the rental market. And then again, very clearly among HAP tenants, the majority of our interviewees who are in receipt of HAP or a rent supplement felt strongly that they were discriminated against. A lot talked about, landlords don't want to know, and being rejected once they had disclosed that they are a HAP subsidy recipient. So for those cohorts in particular, there is a huge incentive to remain in their current tenancy, and a huge potential penalty for leaving their current tenancy. That again intensifies their dependency on their current landlord, and with that constrains their ability to advocate for themselves. So I think there's really major causes for concern here, in that we have a number of quite structural features of the rental market in terms of legislation, in terms of the market context, in terms of discrimination, all of which come together to undermine tenants' agency in very significant respects. The last point I want to make is in a way more of a conceptual one, but I think it's really, really crucial to how we understand the rental sector in general, and to policy and politics in the sector. The whole issue of security and agency came across very clearly in the interviews. It plays out in a social relationship between tenant and landlord, right? When tenants have an issue, and when they think about whether or not they should address an issue, whether they should go to threshold or register a dispute with the RTB, the first thing they think about, it's not what's in the Residential Tenancies Act. The first thing they think about is, how will my landlord react, right? The first thing they try to anticipate is the reaction of their landlord, and then their capacity to deal with that reaction, to manage that reaction, and to get some kind of outcome for themselves. So tenants understand that they depend on their landlord for a home, that social relationship with their landlord is the linchpin of the tenant's access to a home. That is crucial, I believe, to the entire nature of the rental sector and tenants' experience therein. And to be able to control, for the landlord to be able to control the tenant's continuing access to their home, that is an enormous amount of power for one private household to exercise over another household. And I think we don't understand that, or we don't recognize that enough. And I think that analysis of the tenancy relationship as one which represents an asymmetrical power relationship between landlord and tenant, I think that needs to be brought into the heart of policy design. So I'll just finish with two recommendations or conclusions. I don't, again, have time to touch on all the recommendations from the report, but the two kind of key conclusions. First of all, we need to do a lot more to strengthen security of tenure, and we need to bring much more into the control of the tenant in terms of the continuation of their tenancy needs to be something that tenants are in a position to actually exercise some control over. And I think that's particularly the case in terms of grounds for termination, which are based on landlords' intentions for the future, which creates an awful lot of uncertainty for tenants. And the kind of good news, I think, from this research is that by strengthening protections for tenants and security of tenure, we can enhance tenants' experience of renting, experience of home, but we can also empower tenants to advocate for themselves. And that is going to mean that policy in the sector is more effective, and it's going to mean that we can create a culture of compliance in the sector on the part of landlords. So I think there's a huge amount to be gained from strengthening tenants' ability to play an active role in advocating for themselves and in addressing breaches of their rights and of the legislation. And then that last point again is just about the power relationship. Currently in our legislation and in our policy, we think about the landlord-tenant relationship as a contractual relationship between two equal parties. That is very much, I think, the understanding of the tenancy relationship that we see, for example, in the Residential Tenancies Act. This research, I would argue, shows that a more sociologically informed understanding of the tenancy relationship, which recognizes the power asymmetry between landlords and tenants, is actually going to give us a much more accurate picture of the rental sector. And if we incorporate that into how we design policy, right, if we incorporate a recognition of the vulnerability of tenants into the design of policy, I think we're going to see more effective policies. So thank you for your attention, and that brings to a close my portion of today's proceedings.
Can I, on everybody's behalf, can I thank Dr. Michael Byrne, who's just made, for those of you who've joined us, who's just made a presentation outlining the findings of security and agency in the Irish private rental sector. I think it would be fair to say that this is going to be an important piece of work going forward, and I think, you know, you've put your finger on the core issue there, that it's not a relationship of equals. You know, I mean, on some levels it's more akin to the employment scenario, you know, in terms of the imbalance of relationships between the parties. So thank you very much, Dr. Michael Byrne. I'm going to turn now to Dr. Adriana Michaela Suita, and she's joining us from the University of Glasgow, but she's also a member of the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence. So without further ado, Adriana, can I hand over to you, and thank you very much for being here today.
I thank you very much for the invitation of being today here to Threshold and make and witness the launch of this very important and much needed research on the housing experiences of tenants in Ireland, one of the most regulated Anglo-Saxon countries, and still tenants have difficulties in making a home. So I'm honored to be here today. And in the following minutes, I want to reflect on some of widespread deficiencies in the UK private rental sector, which can be conceived and described as creating a form of social suffering, and which make tenants homeless, even so they pay so high rents to secure a roof over their heads. And I bring harder evidence from 3 cash projects. In 2, I personally interviewed 33 low-income tenants in England and Scotland, who also sent us 247 photos that make testimony of the poor housing condition they endure. I also report on the experiences of over 1,900 tenants in the UK and other lightly regulated markets, as we reviewed in 65 publications, together with Kim McKee and Moira Munro from the Universities of Stirling and Glasgow. And I must say here that we hardly found any evidence on tenants' experiences in Ireland. Even so, we made additional searches to find this literature, so this proved the relevance of MIC's report, which is launched today. In the following, I want to reflect mostly on low-income tenants. And I will start with the widespread issue of disrepair. We had many testimony of the poor, also middle-income tenants suffer mice infestation, mold and damp, broken white good, poor furnishing. Living in such disrepairs make tenants feel stressed, frustrated, anxious, angry. We get angry quite a lot whenever I stop to think about those repairs and think, told us one participant. However, the poorest housing condition we found were in Australia, New Zealand, United States, where the social housing sector is negligible, hence the most vulnerable households must rent privately. And there is plenty of evidence that the market does not work at this end. There is gaps in the floorboard, there is gaps in the walls, it's substandard furnished, exceedingly miserable and bloody cold. That was a common experience. So what such testimony strongly argue, there is no comfort, no choice, no control over the quality of the environment. Therefore, there is no home, since these are its essential qualities, some of its essential qualities. The insecurity given by the ease with which a landlord can evict, it's well known and it's still not fully addressed by policy. Insecurity affects badly the tenants. Eviction creates depression, and it's not compatible with the nature of getting older, and more tenants do so in the UK as well as in Ireland. Relocation, it's expensive, and also make notice, it's difficult. You have to go through this process all the time of being interviewed by people. And if you aren't exactly what someone's looking for, you internalize that feeling that maybe there is something wrong with you. Fear of eviction, it's unsettling and undermine the sense of home. You'll still be kind of living in suitcases and boxes. It should be clearly acknowledged that real as well as feared eviction hanging over one head is a form of social suffering, and it brings anxiety, it brings loss of self-worth, and it brings alienation from that which should have been home. However, we should recognize that the need to personalize is there, whether one is a tenant or a homeowner. And in our research, we found moving evidence of how assembling things thrown away by others into bookshelves and sofas, as you can see in these pictures, give a sense of self, a sense of achievement, despite their obvious transiency and even health hazard. In our research, besides this need for better furnished properties, we also found a less acknowledged need for unfurnished properties. Unfurnished properties indeed allow tenants to make a home of their own, and they are standards in countries with well-regulated PRS such as Germany and Denmark. We found that there are tenants, in particularly those with children and those who rented for a long time, that crave to put their stamp on the place they inhabit, and many or some have done so despite of the fact that eviction hang over their heads. And by doing this, they got a sense of well-being, a sense of achievement, as you see in this quotation. Finally, it's done, and I love it. Linda has done all this with her own hands, using creativity and imagination because she had very little available money. She and her teenage daughter craved to personalize their home for a long time, and it was for the first time that they finally decided to do it. I do not tire of repeating to landlords, please make a standard from providing shelves, hooks, picture rails. They seem so very little, but they actually mean so much. I will not end my presentation with policy recommendations because decision makers know well what they have to do. If they want to allow tenants to create a home in their tenancy, it's affordable rent, security of occupancy, and decent housing. What I want to emphasize is that a broader cultural change is needed to think again about homes and not as assets, whether the home is owned or rented. In our research, we also noted that tenants become better organized in demanding regulatory and cultural change. There is a lot of growing interest in the housing issues and the private rented sector through tenants' unions and organizations that are springing up around the country to give power to renters. I think that provides a space for potential change because ultimately there is so many of us in this country that are renters. And here is where I personally see the best hope. And I show the German flag on the slide because our participants refer to Germany as the model to follow. Of course, as Mick clearly showed, not all tenants can afford to exercise agency. And here, charities like Threshold or shelters are key stakeholders in helping even vulnerable tenants to express their voice. And I call this activism and the driver for change. I also think research should be a driver for change, and our center for UK Collaborative Center for Housing Evidence, it's keen in conducting policy relevant research. We just started our project on housing policy and the COVID pandemic. It has 5 teams and one it's fully dedicated to the private rental sector. One strand of this will look at policy and the decision maker, and the other strand, which I led, has very close affinity with the report of today as we look at tenants' action, agency, and activism. And with this, I thank you for your attention. I show some references which I mentioned in my talk, and I will stop share my screen now.
Adriana, can I just thank you very much for such an interesting presentation. I think you've raised a number of issues there that, you know, really resonate with us in Ireland here. I mean, issues are about the fact that people are renting for much longer periods of time, very much the idea of older renters, the whole issue of well-being and the capacity to even influence your own environment by changing the color of your walls, and also like the whole issue of cultural attitude to renters. You know, the idea that, you know, I don't think it would be unfair to say that in an Irish context, renters are seen as being almost second-class citizens and they don't have the same rights to their homes, for example, people who own their own homes do. And we saw that a lot during the last financial crisis, when there were all sorts of measures put in place to prevent the repossession of owned homes. but those measures were not put in place to prevent the repossession of rented homes. So thank you very much, Adrian. It was really informative. And without further ado, can I move on to Anne-Marie O'Reilly, Thresholds Policy Officer. Anne-Marie, if you could just give us maybe the threshold position.
Yep. Lovely. Thanks very much, Aideen, and thank you very much, Michael and Adriana. I've very much enjoyed reading this report and working with Michael on it, and it's raised some very, very important questions for me in respect of the work of Threshold as well as the other organisations that work in this area. Now, we're not going to be able to answer these here today, but I'm going to put them out there for us to consider, to reflect on, and to incorporate into our work going forward. And that includes also the decision makers, as well as those of us in the non-statutory sector. And so it first of all made me think, is our messaging empowering to tenants? And if not, how do we make it so? How do we let tenants know that they have rights and they can act on them, and how do we empower them? And despite all the new legislation regulating the sector, and as Adriana pointed out, it being one of the most regulated sector, how is it that the sector appears to be becoming more dysfunctional? Or was it always this way, only disguised? And it's because of now that tight market we're in that we're seeing this. And do we try to change the broader dynamics and the structure of the sector, or do we just adapt to the way it is and find, you know, the ways around it, or do we do both? And I think that's always a bit of a tension between working at that broader policy level, but then also trying to provide solutions to the tenants who are experiencing these issues in the now. And then how do we ensure tenants can take action before the conflict trigger, before the 11th hour? So it raised those questions for me for the work at the policy level, but also the work for at our frontline services. And one thing that really struck me was, and it now seems incredibly obvious, but that the insecurity of tenure sits within the landlord's power over the tenants, and this is codified in our legislative framework. And for any of us who work in this field, and particularly those who work in frontline services, know that while the Residential Tenancies Act may look heavy on tenant protections, the reality is not so. And I find that Michael's report gives us the language and the concepts to explore and to tackle this effectively. And so, as with many things, the COVID-19 restrictions have shone a light on the limits to tenant agency, the limitations of the legislation to support security of tenure, as well as the power imbalance in that landlord-tenant relationship. So without the moratorium on evictions, a very significant intervention by the then government, tenants could have still lost their home during a global health pandemic. And after the initial relief, tenants were then left in a sort of suspended state, waiting to find out if the moratorium would be extended and for how long. They had no say, they had no power or influence on this. And despite the moratorium, there have been illegal evictions. There have been attempted evictions and threatened evictions. And even with a global health emergency and emergency legislation, some landlords continue to act with impunity. And when tenants have called us about these evictions, there is a limit of what can actually be done to stop them. And the stress of it all is often so much that some tenants felt they had no choice but to leave the home. And in reality, they would not feel comfortable continuing to live there with the threat of eviction hanging over them. And that uncertainty continues then for those who have lost their jobs and are uncertain whether they will be returning to work full time, if they will have their income again. Will the income supports be there? Will the landlord accept HAP if that time comes? And unfortunately, we have seen, and we hear it every day, tenants telling us, my landlord doesn't want to accept HAP. I can't find a landlord to accept HAP. So again, those tenants, and as Mick pointed out, those tenants who are more reliant on the social housing supports really feel this the strongest. So there's so much more to say about it, but I suppose we are limited on time, but I really do and hope you all enjoy reading it, and that you get a lot out of it for your work and the work of your organisations, and that the policymakers and the decision makers, some who I hope are with us today and who will read this, take this on board as well and see what implications it has for the type of private rented sector we want to see going forward. So I want to thank yourselves again very, very much, and I'll hand it back to Aideen because I believe we might have a few questions.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. We've more than a few questions, and it's really hard to know, where to start actually with the questions. I suppose one of them you kind of touched on there yourself, and that is, from Threshold's point of view, has COVID-19, led to any changes in the kind of landlord-tenant relationship? And if I'm hearing you correctly, and you might maybe talk a bit more about this, I mean, I think it would be fair to say if it wasn't for the moratorium on evictions, the situation would be vastly worse than it is now. But would it also be fair to say that what we're seeing is that we're coming into a period of huge uncertainty as to what's going to happen when this moratorium comes to an end, particularly in situations where tenants have, accrued significant arrears of rent. And maybe you might tell us a bit as well about kind of what some of the implications have been in the kind of landlord-tenant relationship. You mentioned, for example, that some landlords, are ignoring the fact that there's a moratorium on evictions and acting outside the law in any event.
Yeah, I think the very fact that it is a social relationship, as Michael described it, really came to the fore during when the moratorium came into play. So tenants are in a very uncertain situation. Some landlords are in a very uncertain situation. As we know, the majority of landlords in Ireland are small scale with 1 or 2 properties. And then the uncertainty, the moratorium until the 27th of June, or we'll see after that, and it was only extended 3 weeks. You can see the stress and the landlord's just eager to maybe get the tenant out, get the property onto the market for somebody else, maybe somebody who is in work, worried about arrears that are accruing, and the tenant having nowhere to go, even worse than before because there was such a restriction on movement. So unfortunately, we don't get many of the positive stories, and we have heard some out there where landlords have been understanding, have, let's say, reduced the rent, whether on a permanent basis or temporary. But unfortunately, the calls are still coming and the issues are still there. And while initially things calmed down, I think while the whole world came to a standstill, there are still those big issues of landlords attempting to evict tenants illegally, and some unfortunately using quite coercive means to do so. We're about to start ourselves our own survey into the impact of COVID-19 on tenants. So hopefully by the end of the summer, we'll be able to say more about that beyond, I suppose, the anecdotals, which I'm telling you now. But I'd hope to see there a slight rebalancing of the power dynamic between the landlord and tenant in a sort of post-COVID-19 world, but only time will tell. And the uncertainty with the moratoriums, while the moratoriums on evictions and rent increases are positive, that the uncertainty doesn't help. It makes it very difficult for either party to plan, and then it gets a bit personal, it can get a bit nasty, it can get very stressful.
Could I maybe bring Mick in here? You mentioned, Mick, that you didn't have time to talk about more measures that you saw that could be taken to improve the landlord and tenant dynamic. A couple of questions have come in. One, for example, puts the question, we talk about the enforcement regime being tenant led, for example. Now, obviously, you said in the course of the discussion that the OTB does have new powers, and therefore the idea going forward is that it will take a much more proactive role in pushing I suppose it's the legislation that's there to protect tenants, particularly around, say, rent pressure zones and so forth. But there's one of the questions that's come in, and it asks, should we, for example, be looking at putting a lot more onus on landlords, like, for the sake of argument, the need for landlords to apply for, say, a permit to be entitled to rent out property? That's one suggestion that's there. Another questioner has asked, should we be looking, and again, it did come up a bit earlier, should we be looking at something like employment law in terms of the balance there, in terms of the employer-employee relationship dynamic, as a way of addressing the imbalance that tenants have within the system? And just generally speaking, in your opinion, what other measures can we take to empower tenants to level the playing field that they face at the moment?
Thanks, Odin. Yeah, there's quite a lot there in those questions. So I mean, I'll try to kind of respond to them together. And I think one way you can think about it is you've kind of three main parties within the, if you like, tenancy relationship. You have the landlord, the tenant, and then you have the Residential Tenancies Board as the regulator. And I think there's a few things. I think all of those parties need to play a more active role and need to be empowered to play a more active role. So we've already talked about what that might mean for tenants. I would add to that, echoing what Adriana said about also, I think tenants direct organizations and tenants unions can play a role there, right? So we need to strengthen the ability of tenants to play an active role. And I do think as well, we need to formalize the role of landlords, as that questioner put it. So I think Threshold has called for a long time for a kind of NCT for rental properties. And I do think something like that can play an important role in changing the culture around what it means to be a landlord, and to integrate an understanding that when you provide housing, you're providing a good, if you like, which is central to human well-being, and it's a huge responsibility and not something to be entered into lightly. So I think that's important. And then in terms of the regulator, I mean, I absolutely think the regulator can play a much more active role. And I'd see that I think it's a kind of an interesting question and a complex one. And touching on the question from Andrew, I think it was, about the employer-employee employment law context, I think it could be interesting to look at the WRC model and the role that plays in that context. And in particular, in regulating the rental sector, there's a lot of regard for balancing the rights of tenants with the importance of supply to the sector, okay? Now, that's logical, and there's very good reasons for that. However, I think there's an argument that it's not really the place of the regulator to have supply as a focus, or to find that balance, right? In the same way that the WRC will make judgments on the basis of whether or not legislation has been breached, etc., without regard to what the impact of that is going to be on the level of employment, right? So it's not that supply isn't important, but I think it's very difficult to regulate a sector if there's a pressure or a policy culture which is always seeking to balance regulation and supply. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Okay, we're running out of time, so I'm going to ask all three of you a question, and that's this. If there was one change that you could make, if you had the magic wand and there was one change you could make, I mean, again, Adriana, you've seen Mick's presentation and heard from Anne-Marie. In your opinion, looking at it from an Irish context, if there was one change you could make, what would that one change be? So I'll start with Adriana.
For me, the answer of this question is very clear. Tax housing walls, that in ownership, that in landlordship, so that houses stop being assets. Without taxation, I'm afraid, not structural change will happen.
Mick, do you want to give us your one?
I would find it very hard to say one, but one thing which I suppose I think as well is feasible and easily done, I think very realistic and very doable in the short term. I think that there should not be grounds for termination of a tenancy within the tenancy period which are outside the control of the tenant. So I think rent arrears, antisocial behaviour, damage to the property beyond normal wear and tear are reasonable grounds for termination. But otherwise, I think the landlord should have to commit to a tenancy for a defined period of time, and that tenants should know at the outset of a tenancy that it is a 100% up to them to ensure that that the tenancy continues for its period.
Anne-Marie, what would yours be?
Well, I'm going to ask for a sneaky one, because it's like, you know, wishing for more wishes. If we are able to introduce the right to housing, that I think will help open up the way for many other positive changes to come about and start to change that concept of the rented homes as properties, that is the landlord's and not the tenant's home. So it's kind of a wishing for more wishes there.
Okay, look, we're out of time. So just on Threshold's behalf and on behalf of everybody who's able to join us here today, I'd like to thank Dr. Michael Byrne and his colleague, Dr. Rachel McArdle, for, I think, a study that's given us all a lot of reason to think, and a lot of reason, I think, to go forward with a clearer view as to what changes we need to make to level the playing field between landlords and tenants. Somebody did ask the question, but I didn't have time to raise it. Is the situation in the private rented sector different than it is, or more significantly more different than it is in the AHB stroke local authority sector, for example? And I don't want to misquote you, Mick, but I know that you mentioned in the report very early on that the situation for renters, not just here in Ireland, but generally, and not just in Ireland, but in other European countries, is worse for private renters, that in terms of their feelings of insecurity, than it is in other sectors. So I don't want to paraphrase you there, but I think that's correct. So again, I'd like to thank you for the report, and I'd like to thank you for being here today, and also similarly, Dr. Adriana, Michaela, Soeta, thank you very much for joining us and bringing us the experience that you bring to bear from vast knowledge of the sector generally, and in particular the whole issue of security and people's feelings of home. And finally, Anne-Marie, thank you also on Threshold's behalf for your contributions. So thank you very much, everybody. And as I said, Zoom seminars, new way to do things, big learning curve, and certainly Threshold has a number of plans in place to hold a number of other seminars on other aspects of the rental sector. So keep an eye on this space. We will be hosting a seminar shortly on our asks of government under the new programme for government. So that'll be our next seminar. So thank you all very, very much. And I think that's it for today. And